Open a small bag of chips right now and you'll probably feel something. Not quite ripped off, just off. Here's what's actually happening. Companies have found the exact percentage they can shrink your food before your brain notices. Not roughly, not by feel. A specific measurable number, discovered by a scientist over a century ago. And once you know that number, you'll never look at a snack bag the same way again. We're going to walk through exactly how this works, the psychology, the specific brands doing it, and the difference between the part that's genuinely just inflation and the part that's something else entirely. Let's start with the basic move because it's simpler than you'd think: shrinkflation. Keep the price exactly the same. Quietly lower how much you're actually getting. In 2022, a small box of Kleenex tissues dropped from 65 tissues to 65 tissues. Barely worth mentioning on its own, except Kleenex doesn't sell one box, it sells hundreds of millions of them. Multiply that tiny reduction across that kind of volume and you're looking at real money. Money that used to be product, now sitting in a different column on the balance sheet. Toilet paper tells the same story, just stretched across decades. Since the 1960s, Charmin has cut the number of sheets per roll by more than 65%. The size of each individual sheet, down 20% on top of that. Two separate cuts, stacked, for decades, on a product almost every household buys without thinking twice. This isn't new. It's been happening on and off for 75 years. But lately, it's stopped feeling occasional. It started feeling constant. And there's a reason you can't quite put your finger on why. Here's the part that actually explains everything else in this video. In the 1800s, a scientist named Ernst Heinrich Weber discovered something about how human perception works. He called it the just noticeable difference, the exact percentage something has to change before your brain physically registers it. It's different for every sense, every object, but for something like a bag of Doritos, that threshold sits at roughly 13% for weight. A bag has to shrink by 13% or more before your brain flags it as different. So what do companies do? They shrink it by 11%, sometimes 12%, just under the line. Your conscious mind doesn't catch it, but something still feels wrong. You can't explain why the bag feels thinner, you just know it does. That gap between what you can prove and what you can feel is exactly where this entire industry operates. And once shrinkflation stopped being subtle, it started getting almost impossible to ignore. Online, people have started documenting this in real time. And some of it isn't subtle anymore, some of it is almost funny. Picture opening a bag of Gushers and finding 3 gummies inside. Not shrunk, barely there. At that point, it's not a 13% threshold anymore. It's not even trying to stay hidden. So naturally, the question becomes, why? And when companies get asked directly, the answer is almost always the same one word: inflation. It's out of their hands, they say. Prices went up everywhere. They just adjusted. That's the corporate defense. And to be fair to them for a second, it's not entirely wrong. Let's actually look at their side of this, because some of it holds up. During COVID, the US government printed money on a scale that had never happened before. In the 22 months following January 2020, roughly 30% of all US dollars in existence were created. A Frito-Lay representative summed up the corporate position in March 2022. Inflation was hitting everyone, so they took a little bit out of the bag to keep the price the same. And there's real data behind that defense. By the third quarter of 2021, private consumption was already back near pre-pandemic levels. In some categories, like retail sales, demand actually pushed past where it had been before COVID. More demand, constrained supply, rising costs, companies adjusting volume instead of price to cope. Fair enough, that part checks out. But here's where the story stops being that simple. Not every company shrank their products by the same amount. Nestlé, among others, cut sizes by 10% or more, a reduction that outran the actual inflation numbers behind it. And this isn't a 2022 story that ended. In 2025, Simply Orange dropped from 52 ounces to 46. Crystal Light went from 6 packets to 4. Bounty cut its roll from 135 sheets to 123. Look at the wider pattern. Between 2019 and 2023, unit volumes for milk, eggs, yogurt, cereal, beef, and baby food shrank by 2% to 14% across the board. Meanwhile, according to Forbes, prices over that same window rose far past that. Beef up 50%, soft drinks up 60%, yogurt up 47%, candy up 46%, baby food up 45%, smaller portions, bigger price hikes at the same time. Economist Paul Donovan at UBS Global Wealth Management described the mechanism plainly. Companies close to the consumer had persuaded customers to accept not just the real cost increases, but a little bit more on top. Margin dressed up as necessity. So if the excuse was inflation, where's the data that actually proves it? Here's a comparison that's hard to argue with. The think tank Groundwork Collaborative calculated that in 2024, U.S. consumer prices rose 3.4% over the year. Meanwhile, actual input costs for producers, the raw expense of making the product, rose by only 1%. If the increase were purely about covering costs, prices should have tracked that 1%. Instead, there's an extra 2.4% sitting on top, unexplained by input costs, landing directly in profit margins. And that's not a one-year blip. Corporate profits accounted for 53% of inflation during the second and third quarters of 2023. In the 4 decades before the pandemic, profit only drove about 11% of price growth. This isn't just an American story either. In the UK, a 2024 study covering more than 17,000 firms found average pre-tax profit margins in 2022 sitting 30% above pre-pandemic levels, across everything from energy and banking to vets and car dealerships. In Australia, corporate profit increases accounted for more than half of the inflation that ran above the central bank's target, an estimated $100 billion in excess profits between late 2019 and mid-2023. In Canada, total after-tax corporate profits ran 55% higher than they were in 2019. 4 countries, same pattern. Consumer watchdogs have started calling this greedflation, and whatever you want to call it, the argument some economists are making is that these numbers point to something well beyond simple cost recovery. But shrinking the package isn't the only tool companies have found. There's a second, quieter version of this. Not less product, a cheaper product. It's called skimpflation, swapping in cheaper ingredients while keeping the packaging and the price the same. The clearest example in American history, Coca-Cola. In the 1980s, following changes to corn subsidies, Coke began replacing raw sugar with high-fructose corn syrup in its U.S. recipe. It didn't happen overnight. First it was 50% corn syrup, then 75%. Within 4 years, there was no raw sugar left in the formula at all. You've probably noticed at some point that a product just tastes different than you remember. Cheaper, somehow, even if you can't name why. That's the mechanism. And it's the argument some analysts make that an entire generation has grown up only ever tasting the corn syrup version, never the original, which would mean their baseline for normal was already shifted before they ever had a say in it. That's an interpretation, not a measured fact, but it's a genuinely useful way to think about why the shift goes unnoticed by anyone who didn't live through the change themselves. So companies can shrink the box, they can swap the ingredients. Is anyone actually pushing back? Some governments have started trying. Australia has warned companies they could face public penalties and fines for misleading package sizes. In 2024, South Korea went further. Regulators now require companies to label products for at least 3 months after shrinking them, backed by a fine of 10 million won. That sounds significant until you convert it, a little over $7,000. A rounding error against the profits shrinkflation can generate at scale. In the US, back in the 1960s, a law forced companies to disclose product weight clearly. Their workaround? Placing the label in the most inconspicuous spot on the package they could find, technically compliant, practically invisible. More recently, the Shrinkflation Prevention Act attempted to get the FTC to formally treat this as a deceptive practice. The bill never received a vote before the legislative session ended. Across 33 countries surveyed, 46% of people said they'd seriously noticed products shrinking while prices held steady. In Great Britain, France, Germany, Canada, and the Netherlands, more than half the population has become vocal about it. Both of these things are true at once. Real inflation happened, and companies genuinely had to adapt to real cost increases. And separately, once that inflation started cooling, a meaningful share of companies kept the price hikes and the smaller portions anyway, not out of necessity, but because customers kept buying. The Weber threshold explains why so few people noticed early enough to push back individually. It doesn't explain why, once enough people started noticing, so little actually changed. The only real tool available to you right now, check the small print. Unit pricing, the cost per ounce or gram, is required on most shelf labels and cuts straight through package size games. Compare it against store brands, which are rarely engineered around the same threshold. I'm not going to tell you this ends with the next bag you buy, but now you know why it never felt like your imagination, because it wasn't.